To give a brief introduction of what we're talking about, and we'll talk more about ourselves here in a second. This is our first of 3 sessions on ChatGPT and other large language learning models. This is going to be hosted on our Figma. Just as a brief FYI, you can find the Figma link in the chat or in the description of this video. In order to use Figma, here's a few things on my screen. I'll be screen sharing alongside this to help you kind of move around and see what's going on. Primary things that you probably want to concern yourself with. To move around, you can either use the hand tool on the bottom. There's like a little hand symbol, and you can click and drag, and it will help you move around. If you're on a computer, you can also use your middle mouse button to move around as well, or like the 2 or 3 finger swipe, depending on how, if you have a Mac, how you have it configured. You can also zoom in and out by using the zoom function in the upper right, or you can use control and scroll wheel, or command and scroll wheel, to zoom in and out. That's primarily how you're going to get around this tool. We use this a lot in our professional development, and also if we were teaching in the classroom, because it's a cool way to visualize what would typically be slides in a more 3-dimensional space, which allows us to like kind of jump around and also have an artifact at the end that you can still access this thing and easily see what other folks contribute, and you'll see that throughout. If you have any questions about Figma, please let us know in the chat. We're more than happy to go through that, but we'll practice here in a bit. Second, we just scroll over here to the right. If you haven't already signed in or signed up for ChatGPT, now is a good chance to do so. This link on the left is the browser-based version. Note that there's also an app. I have the Google Play and the Apple Store versions of that on here. It just takes a Microsoft or Google account. I believe if you don't have one of those, I'm pretty sure you have to make one. I don't think they have a separate login system, but please correct me if I'm wrong. ChatGPT is pretty easy to use in terms of its actual baseline functionality, but we'll be diving into educational applications here in a bit. Random fun fact, if you've been using ChatGPT and you're looking for a more advanced function, I'm going to tab over on my screen, so you'll have to kind of go back and forth between the Zoom and the Figma. But note that they just added this feature on ChatGPT. If you go to your profile here on the bottom left, there's a custom instructions button. This is pretty neat. It allows you to type in contextual information about yourself on the top and contextual information on how you want ChatGPT to respond to things. So in terms of education tools, you could, for example, type in here, like, always type your responses at a 6th grade reading level, or always respond in a neutral tone for a classroom, or something like that. And all things that you input into ChatGPT by default will have those responses in there. So some nice ways to pre-program this thing to use it in the way that you'd like. But other than that, we'll be diving into how to use ChatGPT, because it's like one box to type in. Finally, note that this is brought to you by our donors. So thank you if you donate to join this session, and or if you're a donor of HRP at large. We appreciate it. As we continue to grow as an organization and do this work, I know Nick and I are heavily thankful for your sponsorship to be able to do this stuff. And do note, we also have a funding drive going on. So if you're watching this, or if you're attending and you want extra merch and to support all the other stuff we do at HRP, we got some donor gifts for you. You can check that out on our website. So with that said, Nick, I'm going to toss it over to you to do some intro stuff, and then we'll dive into it.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's talk about who we are. So if you don't know and you click to join us, or you're watching this, Human Restoration Project is a 501c3 nonprofit in the United States. And those donations that you make for our funding drive, and any of those things, are also tax deductible. So you'll get a little receipt from us at the end of the year that you can use in your taxes too. But who are we and what are we doing? So we're informing, guiding, and growing a movement toward progressive, human-centered education, bringing together a network of radical educators like yourself who are transforming classrooms across the world. So when we say inform, we've got a podcast, a brand new episode out today, the first in a 3-part series from our intern, Noah. He's been talking to folks in Hawaii about basically the pedagogy of the Hawaiian Islands, and the history, the background, the context, and how that's influential. We've also got enormous amounts of writing on our writing page, and we are, I think, the only place on the internet that has a progressive education research hub as well to help inform our own practices. So then, yeah, as far as guiding goes, if you're watching this on YouTube, we've had some enormous success recently. So thank you if you're watching and subscribing to that. We also provide a number of free resources and this EduFuturism series. So if you're watching this now, you're participating in this now, you're in our guide mode. And then the grow, of course, is to follow us basically anywhere on social media at HumResPro. And we offer a number of virtual and in-person options to help you get involved at a deeper level between in-person conferences, remote conferences, and of course our volunteer page, and join us everywhere else on social media. And we have a special guest here today too, who's with us, who's going to help us understand both this and when we present at NCTE on this topic here in the next couple months. Trevor, if you want to go ahead.
So hello, everyone. My name is Trevor Aleo. I'm a 10th grade American literature teacher. I am also an author, a consultant, and a doctoral student at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I'm studying how we can use multiliteracy theory in English language arts classrooms, curriculum, and instruction. So I've been experimenting with AI quite a bit in my context, and I'm really excited to be joining Chris and Nick to chat with you today and look at some applications and some ways that we can find humanizing ways of bringing AI into our classrooms.
Awesome. Thanks, Trevor. And to add on to that, this has been a huge focal point for HRP here, especially in the last year or so, as we talk with folks and build resources related to AI and classroom use, which we'll dive into here in a second. At the end, we'll link to more things that Nick and I have put together over the last year or so on artificial intelligence.
Yeah. So I think given the size and scope of our audience here, we'll kind of skip our context. We'll give participants maybe a couple of minutes to fill that out, and we can reference that. But let's just go ahead and talk about the outline of what it is that we're going to do today in this session. So yeah, this is part of our bigger concept of, how do we understand how to use these AI tools without losing our humanity? How can we actually use them for good and really understand what ChatGPT in particular is and is not? And so really we'll try to tackle three big things here today. Just how does it work? Try to demystify and really deconstruct this large language model that ChatGPT and other sort of AI models use, how and why you might use these tools like ChatGPT in a classroom context, and we'll actually get you in there using them and walk through some use cases for teachers and students alike in ways that are going to help support your practice, help get students thinking critically about using AI, and really just kind of incorporate it in new and interesting ways, rather than, as I'll talk about here after Chris gets going, in proactive rather than reactive ways. But Chris, anything to add to that before you get into like the nuts and bolts of what it is and how it works?
Yeah, the final bit of context I would add is that because this is part of a 3-part series, the session that you're attending here today is kind of the normal beginner friendly, this is what the thing is, and demystifying that concept and just giving more details, as well as starting to dive into it. Our second session goes into a lot of different details about how it could be used in a classroom, and it's pretty much all examples. And then our final session is about the critical analysis lens. So ethical concerns, bias concerns, how the information is sourced, like post-truthism, and analyzing that, etc. Our general view on this that Nick will talk about is that this is very similar to the advent of Wikipedia or the internet itself, where it's a hyper useful tool that really can transform the way that we work and how we think about things, but it's not going to completely destroy the world, nor is it foolproof and perfect. And we can shape that and go from there. And yeah, we'll skip that your context session just because we already have the interest in the chat is right at such a small group. So just to provide some background information on ChatGPT, we often hear ChatGPT described as a black box, as in we don't really need to understand how it works, and it just does. But we thought it would be worthwhile to provide some description of what exactly this thing is doing and how it works. And I think it's worth going through with kids as well, what this thing is, because there's been almost a panic that ChatGPT is going to develop into some form of sentient AI, we've heard it described as like the 2001 Space Odyssey HAL style artificial intelligence. And that's not what ChatGPT is. So a little bit about how it works. Essentially, this is really complicated computational statistics that's used to produce best answers. It's like a incredibly complicated version of autocomplete, but on steroids. It's a form of what's called narrow AI, which means that ChatGPT can do one specific task very well, but it doesn't apply what it learns to other processes, nor does it actually understand what it is that it's doing. It's cross-checking itself. This is from Wolfram Alpha here on the left. This is an example of an artificial intelligence computation. It's just really complicated statistics. In really basic terms, if you consider it like this, on the left side is a typical XY axis. If we were considering this from a chat standpoint, if you have an input that says this, the output might be this. So we're just comparing two different protocols or prompts. But in ChatGPT, you're comparing potentially thousands of different prompts all at the exact same time in 3D space with a lot of variables. And it's predicting where that should go based off all those variables at the exact same time. Again, it's really hard to rationalize and figure out what that means, but it is worth noting that this is just statistics. It's not magic. It learns through what's called training by being fed large amounts of data. It's fed things from Wikipedia, from archival websites, from social media websites like Reddit, and then it's improved by using data from one source, for example, Wikipedia's math formulas, and then transferring that knowledge to another source that's similar. So for example, Berkeley's knowledge base on music rhythms. Those things are not the exact same thing, but we can train AI by combining a variety of different sources and mixing and matching them. This is done hundreds of thousands of times to create these really complex statistical formulas that then receive additional manual training from contractors, which is problematic. We'll get to that in the third session, I'm sure. But the way that this information is actually gathered reflects a lot of the existing biases and ethical concerns of our society at large, just as how many websites are built in quite problematic ways. But before we get into that, I'll turn it over to Nick to talk a little bit about what we're thinking about this as.
Yeah. So the interesting thing, I mean, we obviously have seen a lot of reaction from the education system broadly. K-12, higher education. I tried to snag some headlines and statistics to help capture what that is. And I think one of the most striking ones for me was this Texas A&M University professor who flunked all of his seniors when he ran their essays through some purported ChatGPT a cheating algorithm thing to see whether or not students had used ChatGPT, and it came back with a bunch of false positives and flunked them all just at the whim of the algorithm. And of course, on the other side of this, the need, I suppose, for students to understand the impact of AI, because it's been reported that AI could replace the equivalent of 300 million jobs in the near future. I don't know if there's a timeline on this, but sometime in the near future, AI is going to steal all the jobs. So there's that. And then if you scroll down here just a little bit more, Chris, I've actually found some survey data that showed about 1/3 of students indicated their professors have threatened to fail students caught using AI technologies. And of course, there's probably a big spectrum on what actually using ChatGPT as a generative tool to help with academic work looks like. About another third of students say their university has issued guidance for that. So kind of shocking that not more universities in particular. I know K-12 is similarly in the weeds on this. But really nobody knows how to use these things. And then 6 in 10 students think universities should not ban ChatGPT and other similar AI technologies. So I'm willing to bet that probably the ballpark for K-12 is very similar. And so that's a bit on the reactive side, right? We're trying to play catch up with these tools and kind of buying into their own hype. But I always reference when I'm talking about AI tools, this is a fake Slavoj Žižek quote. It's not real. It's just a parody that's attributed to him. But it says that AI will be the death of learning and so on. To this, I say no. And you can kind of hear his own little bulldogish nature going on. My student brings me their essay, which has been written by an AI, and I plug it into my grading AI, and we are free. While the learning happens, our super ego is satisfied. We are free now to learn whatever we want. And that, for me, really takes the shape of like, how do we use AI without losing ourselves? So if it is a task that really can be done by AI and graded by AI, well, fine, let AI do all those things. We can focus on the human stuff. And then on the proactive side, here's one professor. And the reason why I wanted to include so much higher education is often in the context of college and career readiness, we talk a big game about how we get kids using tools and prepared for the next level. And really, ChatGPT and other AI tools are going to be a necessary part of that conversation going forward. So here's a professor at the University of Toronto in biochemistry, no limits on how they use AI, saying students will be assessed on the quality of their work. It has to be well thought through. It has to be validated and correct. And he always has oral exams that will remain. They say the human aspect of learning is one of the few invariants, but they might ask their favorite AI to help. And so here's an example of somebody who's really thinking proactively about how to get kids using the tools, and then also just assessing them in interesting, human-centered ways that requires kids to still be able to know and do the requirements of the course if they're going to be successful. And he goes on to say, the world is changing, and if we don't prepare our students to work with AI resources, we are not preparing them for the world. If we spend our time on making our courses AI proof, we are missing the point of education. We need to teach our students how to have the AI think with them, not for them. This is the most important goal. If we don't achieve that, the AI will become their competitor. So I wanted to include this as just a good way of healthy thinking about how to include AI, how to avoid shutting it out of the conversation with school, because it's important that education embrace it and teach students how to use it as a helpful tool. And I included a link on there as well. So how do we use AI without losing ourselves?
So yeah, we're going to give a pretty bullish account of all of the different affordances of ChatGPT and AI today. But we did want to acknowledge some of the ethical quandaries that come along with that process. We're going to have a whole other session that digs deep into that. But the thing that we wanted to talk about today is this notion of using AI without losing ourselves. So as a humanities teacher, the human part of learning is very important to me. And just for the purposes of this session, I'm going to run through a list of the 5 things that my 2 doctoral advisors, some people in my cohort who are doing AI research have sort of pulled out that discuss the sort of loss of the social nature and the contextual nature of education that we sort of see as so important in progressive pedagogy. And these are just things to keep in mind as we run through all the potential uses of ChatGPT and other AI tools in education, because there are certainly some issues and holes, and we don't want it to sound as though we aren't cognizant of those. So the first thing, and I have a personal anecdote for this one, is sourcing. So the machine varies its sources. We have no idea where the AI is getting the information from when we ask it a question. And as an example, I was trying to find a way to streamline some of my research processes as I was working on my dissertation. And I asked it, hey, do you have any articles on disciplinary literacy? And the first one that it pumped out was pretty good. I checked it out. And then the next 3, I was in the library database and I was looking around. I was like, I can't find this. And it was a completely made up source. So ChatGPT created a source, created a journal, created a person who wrote the article. So the problematics of that, I think, should be pretty apparent, that we can ask for academic sources, or we can ask for, well, where did you get this information, as it generates a response, and it can't do that. So I think it's really important to understand where these answers are coming from, and we aren't able to do that with ChatGPT. So next is facts. So the machine doesn't have any notion of empirical truth. So what that means is, as Chris was mentioning earlier, ChatGPT is a large language model. So it doesn't understand fact from fiction, reality from unreality. All it does is sort of scrape text and think about what words are placed next to other words that it finds based on the huge data set that it has. So it doesn't really have any understanding of what's real, but it's really good at sounding as though it does. So again, the tricky nature of that when we're asking students to potentially use it as a tool to learn and understand their world can be apparent, where untruths are mixed in with truths, reality are mixed in with things that are completely created by ChatGPT in order to construct what is a coherent narrative based on the algorithm. Next is theory, and I think this one is pretty interesting. So the machine has no conception of a theoretical frame or disciplinary practice. So what that means is, in the example that the researchers give, is it doesn't understand the connection between dogs and kennels. So like there is no ontology that the ChatGPT has. It is only looking at what words occur next to each other. It doesn't understand the relationship between dogs and kennels, right? Dog as the animal or the creature that belongs in the kennel because that is how humans and people organize the world. It does no conception of that. And it's really easy to hear AI and to immediately go to, what's that Will Smith movie, iRobot, and we sort of like anthropomorphize and we see it as a living, breathing, thinking thing, and it's not. It's just basically really good at understanding the things that humans type, taking that text, and then spitting it back out at us in a way that is recognizable. So okay, yeah, so I see that Chris is going to talk about that shortly. So I'll pause there, but I think it's really interesting because it seems brilliant, it seems smart, but really it has no conception of ontology or the relationship between different concepts. So the next two I see is kind of being linked. First being ethics. So it's socially well-mannered, but it's not because its sources are necessarily that. So that can be particularly insidious when it presents really problematic information in a way that comes across as being well-mannered, right? If it's sucking up information from the darkest corners of 4chan and Reddit, but then it's presenting it to you in a very mild-mannered way, the content itself might be incredibly problematic, but the presentation will be pretty respectable and seemingly well-mannered. So it can kind of hide, again, going back to that prior point, where that information is coming from. And it can kind of subversively sneak it in a way that feels acceptable and presentable. And that kind of also goes to the critical dialogue piece, where it does have a tendency to be what they phrase as uncritically affirmative. So meaning whatever ideas you're sort of feeding into it or biases you were pumping into it, it's not going to be like, the way that you phrase that question or the content of this question that you're posing might have issues or might be presenting a hegemonic opinion or perspective. There have been a lot of examples in an English language arts context of being like, what are the 10 best novels ever written? And unsurprisingly, they are all sort of your traditional canonical written by, dead white guy kind of texts. And, not that necessarily anything's wrong with those texts, but if we outsource our thinking to large language models about what we consider, worthwhile text to read, to engage with, all we're going to continue doing is reproducing the same sort of hegemonic opinions that we're trying to move past, right, as progressive educators. And if we aren't thinking about where it's getting those sources, plugging back up to the earlier one, we are sort of putting ourselves at an impasse. We can't move forward because we're only repeating what's being spoken back to us based on the websites presenting that past that are being scraped by the large language model.
Yeah, and building off of that, as we transition now into using it, there might be some extreme cognitive dissonance here, because you hear about all of these concerns and issues with using generative AI to then say, hey, we should be using generative AI. And that seems like it might be an issue, but keep in mind that it's no different than the internet or pretty much any tech tool that has come before. The internet itself is highly problematic because it's found within systems of oppression that already exists. It's the same systems that we always find ourselves in. It doesn't mean that ChatGPT can't have a critical lens applied to it. It doesn't mean it can't be transformative. It doesn't mean that it can't be useful. It's just these are things that we have to keep in mind as we navigate this system, instead of saying something like, it's going to revolutionize education. So let's just use it forever without any nuance at all. To address Ezra's point here in the chat, who asks whether or not ChatGPT counts as plagiarism, as in, like, if I use it to create a course description for a class, should I use that without citing it, etc. We've always kind of leaned on the side of what we call radical transparency, which is, it's actually two things. The first is recognizing that everyone's probably going to end up using ChatGPT, so banning the tool is not worthwhile. Kids, even if you tell them not to use ChatGPT, are going to use ChatGPT. So we need to make that a transparent process where we talk about how we use it, why we use it, and so we can bring up these ethical concerns so kids understand what they're using. The second part of that, though, is that means that you need to find a way to ensure that you know when kids are using it and encouraging them to let you know when they're using it. And I think the best way to do that is by modeling the citation element. The most common way I've seen this is people will cite what they asked the prompt. So like they'll cite, this was created using ChatGPT with a prompt, and then summarizing the prompt afterwards. And it gives a good introduction, I think, for kids to model that behavior in the classroom and to bring it up. You could also, in the exact same way, tell kids flat out, like, hey, for this assignment, I don't want you to use ChatGPT. This other assignment you could, if you do use it, please cite it. Just because this has the ability to change how things work doesn't mean that we should just let ChatGPT do everything for us. In the exact same way that calculators have existed for a very long time, but in many math classes, at some points, you don't use a calculator. That's just how tools work. This is describing just like any other tool. So again, if you have any other questions, feel free to put them in the chat as we go. This part will be a little bit more interactive. We're going to move into two very broad, fairly basic applications for ChatGPT. And again, our second session, we're going to get into the weeds and do like 20 of these. But for now, we're just going to keep things really basic. I was going to introduce, I'll do these first two, then turn it over, and then we'll do them all at once as a group and kind of play with it and see how it works. So consider this from a teaching standpoint, that ChatGPT is really good, especially at really low stakes stuff, like supplanting information, taking information, making it easier, harder, changing up words, generating acronyms, that kind of stuff. Consider if you have a group of students who could either use this to empower themselves, or teachers that are just trying to make their lives easier. Something that I always struggled with is I would come across texts, especially in a history class, that were really good stuff, but it was way too hard for the kids to read. It was difficult for me to read. And it was so much time to take all of that and transcribe the words into something that's easier, to make it more summarized, etc. ChatGPT is really good at complex tasks like this. So taking down those complicated phrases, readings, Google documents that you've made. Here's an example of a prompt. If you take this phrase and write it at 6th grade reading level, it will translate this super complicated, like, underpinnings of post-structuralist discourse analysis from a focal point, etc., and just say, like, hey, that means that smart people are arguing about how words and power work together to make meaning in different cultures. We could just talk about that together, because it's essentially what that means. This also allows you to easily do scaffolding, where if a student isn't familiar with a process or a protocol, or people just need more steps broken down for them, if you, for example, tell it, hey, take this instruction, break it down in a scaffolded step-by-step process, write it at 6th grade reading level, make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, classic writing exercise, here is what ChatGPT will output to you. It will give you every single one of the steps and then give you details on how to do every single one of those steps. So as I'm thinking about this, I'm both thinking about this from a teacher lens to make my life easier. Whenever I have to start doing these really mundane things, I can have it do it for me, but also teaching kids that ChatGPT can do this, so that when they come across something that we've done in class, they can use it to help break down these ideas. Another kind of similar example for multilingual use here in the second box is that there's a huge use case here in quickly translating information in a way that Google Translate and other translation tools can't. So first off, it can easily translate large amounts of information. Obviously, if you ask it to write something in Spanish or Japanese or Icelandic, whatever it might be, it can quickly translate that stuff, which makes your life a little bit easier in terms of long documents. Maybe you're sending home a parent letter and it should be in Spanish as well. Really easy to do that. But the thing that this affords you, unlike typical language like translation tools, is that it allows you to provide context. You can give additional prompts to make less literal translation to understand that context which shapes a statement. So for example, in this here, I have it taking a poem and writing it in Japanese, but I tell it to preserve the structure. So I still want it to be formatted like this. So it takes it, it puts it into Japanese, and you can see that it actually transforms what the phrasing is. Like it actually changes up how the words are placed to make the structure similar. In the exact same way that if you told it like, hey, this is a financial document, please use financial language and write this in Japanese. If you've ever used a translation tool before, you'll know that it does the most literal translation typically. And a lot of times it doesn't make sense in the context of the other language. Here we can give that context, so it will change up the phrasing to make it make sense for the learner or for the audience. Finally, just a brief side note, this also works with code. I use this all the time. If you're into programming, you probably use like GitHub Copilot or something like that. It makes your life a lot easier. If you tell it to write code, it will write code. Similarly, if you ask it what certain code means, it will not only tell you what the code snippet is, but also it will break down those different sections. And I'll go from there. Ezra, I'll read that here in a second and address it, but I'll turn it over to whoever's doing this, and then we'll play with it.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about tailoring messages for an audience. So when it comes to writing instruction, and this is true outside of English language arts as well, one of the issues is the genres that we often ask students to compose in are pretty artificial. They don't really look a lot like the types of writing that occur outside of the classroom. And one of the ways that we can kind of use ChatGPT to help with that is we can take models that we have or previous assignments that we've worked on and consider how ChatGPT can help us adjust for a variety of purposes, contexts, and audiences. I recommend this more as like a model or a demonstration, just to help students understand the implications of writing for different audiences or in different genres, more so than I do, outsourcing students' work to just kind of like do that and ask them to change this for a new audience. So the example that I have here is is a model paragraph that I have when I'm discussing argumentative writing in my English class. So one of the things that you could do is to take or ask ChatGPT to take this paragraph, which is talking about some of the issues with the way that traditional schooling is structured, and then rewrite it for different stakeholder groups. So how would the exact same content of this paragraph look different if you're writing for students or for teachers or for policymakers? And as a way to kind of have students apply this knowledge, one of the things that I have experimented with is a few years ago, my students had to write a sort of traditional position paper based on our curriculum. And the audience was a think tank. It was policymakers, it was people in positions of authority and power to make a change based on whatever their topic was. And it was related to some of the affordances and problems that emerge with technology. So they did that very sort of traditional, formal genres. But then I asked them to remix that same message for a different audience. So if you were writing this sort of like policy brief to talk about ways to limit the amount of time that kids are spending on TikTok or something, that message is going to look very different if you are creating a policy brief than if you are trying to send a message directly to kids, maybe even on TikTok itself. So modeling and showing students and using ChatGPT as a tool for text, and I don't think we're going to get into the other modalities that we can use large language models and AI for producing, but you can have students remix content that they've created in one mode or genre into a different mode or genre and for different audience. So it can kind of help you see the way that rhetorically, if we're trying to reach different audiences, there are different choices that we can make. And ChatGPT is really good at showing that in I'd say a shallow way. So it's going to like change the language a little bit. It might change the structure a little bit, but in terms of like understanding the nuances of like what sort of trends are happening on TikTok or what are Swifties talking about in their fandom community, it's not going to pick up on those subtleties. So that's something that you can ask your students to kind of bring in themselves. So when it comes to teacher uses, these are tangentially related to the example I gave, but are a little bit more specific. Um, you can also take a text or topic and see what changes ChatGPT makes on different genre conventions. So if you are teaching your students about how to write in a particular genre, you can take several texts and ask it to like remix the same content in that genre. And then you have kind of a text set that you can use to better understand way text structures sort of are produced within that genre. So you can use it as kind of like a close-up genre study or as a way to see how other genres portray content. And so you can be like, oh, like I noticed that all fairy tales sort of share this structure, or I noticed that arguments sort of share that structure. And it's a good way to produce those really quickly instead of you having to go and find a bunch of different ones yourself or to write them yourself. You can also adjust messages for students with different needs, perspectives, beliefs, etc. So if you have something that you are exploring in class that might be ideologically or politically sensitive, and you're trying to figure out how you can phrase it for a variety of learners, maybe you have a classroom with just a different set of students, how can you rephrase or reframe what it is you are saying using ChatGPT as sort of a thought partner? Something else that I've used before too is it's creating a set of sentences with common grammar usage and mechanical errors. So let's say that you're noticing that students are really struggling with like semicolons. I would just say use an M dash because I think M dashes are the best anyway. They should replace basically every other punctuation mark. But instead of sitting and spending a bunch of time creating these model sentences, you can just use ChatGPT to come up with a bunch itself. So that is a really great time saver that can help you kind of figure out what are maybe grammatical or mechanical issues or struggles your students are having and creating sets of sentences that you can work with them on. So I also think that students themselves can take advantage of some of the benefits of this writing for different purposes, audiences, and contexts. So if you have students with dyslexia, they can use this to input their writing to catch potential errors or mistakes. So let's say they're doing a writing assignment, and instead of having to wait on you to jump into the doc and catch those, errors or do a peer editing, that time is better spent looking more at content, structure, big picture ideas. So students can just hop on ChatGPT, take a sentence that they were working on that maybe the text was muddled, ask ChatGPT to correct any errors, and they can also kind of help them see maybe what are words or letters they have a tendency to mix up. So it's just a sort of a quick go-to resource or thought partner to bounce ideas off of that can save time for the student and the teacher. Lastly, for neurodivergent students who are worried about understanding or being understood by neurotypical peers, they can use ChatGPT as a way to check their emails, messages, or correspondence. My wife ribs me a little bit because I spend way too long on emails because as a function of my ADHD, I struggle with either giving way too much context or way too little context. So if you have students with similar struggles, ChatGPT can be a great tool to sort of be like, hey, can you streamline this? Can you provide enough context so my the reader knows kind of what I'm talking about and that sort of thing. And I think that it's good to have another being, I don't want to say person, to bounce ideas off of as you are composing messages. And I know that for me, it's sort of alleviated anxiety I've had when I've had to like send a Tushy email. So it's really great for those purposes.
For sure. So I'm gonna pause here and give us just a few minutes just to play around with this. Nick and Trevor, I'll do this a little bit on my screen, but for folks that are joining us here today, if you want to try any of this in ChatGPT, again, there's a link right above that takes you there. If you go like way up here to where it says getting started on ChatGPT, you can mess around with any of these. Feel free to add either in the chat or right on here. If you click and drag a post-it note, you can add questions, concerns, additional ideas, things that we should know about. But as we spend some time on our own ChatGPT, just kind of talking about this out loud, feel free to play around with it. And then we'll fast track, we'll do kind of the play session first on these next three. But yeah, so I just kind of wanted to briefly review because this is something that we've been doing a lot organizationally. Nick and I were just at a school not too long ago talking about translating standards into student-friendly language, something that I feel like a lot of especially K-12 teachers find themselves doing. And if I just go to, let's say, the National Council for the Social Studies standards, and I pull up, one of these, let's take, it wasn't pre-prepared, here we go, this one. So it's like institutions are the formal and informal, political, social, and it's all this. This would take me at least 15 minutes to actually go in there and dive into it and put this at something that kids can understand, and to an extent that I would understand. It's very easy for me to take something like this and say, can you write this at a 6th grade reading level, break it down into bullet points, tell it to do that, boom, do that. I can double check it to make sure, but now not only is this in student-friendly language, but it's also in a way that we can understand it. So it's not just this giant hunk of text. This is way easier for both me to understand and for kids to understand, which makes our lives a lot easier. And the exact same way, building off of that, we can say, write this in Spanish, and it will be able to have the Spanish version for our students that would be more comfortable reading Spanish, as well as kind of diving into what Trevor was saying. Perhaps there's a way that we can kind of build all three in together, where it's like different genres. So like write this in English, but prepare it as a formal report. I don't even know what that's going to do. There you go. And then it will format it for us with the table of contents, executive summary, etc. It's not that we don't want students to understand or be able to dissect that text in the initial example, but for mundane things, that's not what we're focusing on. This gives us just such an easier way of taking the mundaneness out of it.
Right.
Nick, do you have something to add? Yeah.
Yeah, let ChatGPT handle the bureaucracy, and then you can copy that and modify it and stuff as need be. I was just going to chime in too. One really powerful example that was shared with me, and that I worked with a team in Poland. I was in Poland at the beginning of June, talking about some similar issues with this. How do we use AI without losing ourselves? And the topic came up about using ChatGPT to translate materials into Ukrainian, because obviously they've had a lot of Ukrainian refugees as an outcome of the war. And now they have kids in classrooms who don't understand how to speak Polish. And of course, it's not going to be perfect. Of course, it's just a temporary stopgap solution. But in a lot of cases, it's better than not letting kids in those scenarios get access to materials. So there's a lot of interesting accessibility implications for the teacher use of ChatGPT in the absence of resources and experts and translators and those other things too, that can be a boon to kids and adults alike. So I thought I'd put out that very practical use case, particularly for Spanish translation or for other languages elsewhere in the United States that you may not have access to expert translators for.
Really quick too, before we dive into the second section, there was a question asked in the chat surrounding a student using ChatGPT to sound smarter, quote unquote, and referencing that, and like whether or not that would be okay, because we do want students to be able to write academically, but at the exact same time, ChatGPT can make our lives easier in that way. So it's kind of a nuanced answer, and this will be part of our second session in a certain way, which is, one, it's good the kids actually saying it. So being open about it, I think, makes a huge difference, because then we can have conversations about that and discuss with kids why in certain cases we don't want to do that. So we can have guidelines for assignments that say, for this assignment, hey, we're not going to use AI at all to assist us. The second part of that, though, is we can have activities then on what does it mean to sound smarter? Like if we tell ChatGPT, make this sound smarter, can we dissect that and get into like language and language discrimination and the politics of language? And like there's so many interesting conversations we can have with ChatGPT that help us analyze that kind of zeitgeist or mainstream thought in society. It helps us dissect hegemony in a really interesting way that we typically wouldn't be able to do, at least not easily. But that's a conversation for the second session, I think, to have in more detail. For these, Nick, do you want to just like give like a really brief overview, and then I'll just show it on the screen using ChatGPT?
Yeah, I was going to say Chris kind of had alluded to this one in the example that he was just doing, because very oftentimes standards are written for teachers, and then we are expected to put them on the board or put them in documents or put them in lesson plans. But students don't really know what they mean because they're not written in student-friendly language. They're not student-focused documents. So ChatGPT can actually help you take the list of standards. I just pulled from Common Core ELA standards. Here's some ones about reading and literacy. I asked ChatGPT to turn this into language that could be understood by an 8th grader. And these are the 8th grade standards. It gave, I think, some more wordy, but there's some explanatory power here, but I thought it was too much. So I simply added an additional prompt afterwards to say, make this less wordy, or you can ask ChatGPT to simplify this, and it just does a real good job of that. So cite textual evidence that most strongly supports an analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text, becomes, when you read, find the words that tell you exactly what's happening and what you can guess. It's like finding clues in the story. So that took me 2 seconds to try and put it in student-friendly language. It may not be perfect, but you can take the ChatGPT output and modify it for your own kids, your own context too. So you're not obligated at any point to just take what ChatGPT says at face value. Of course, you can modify, add, subtract, etc. And then actually one of the uses of this too could just say, hey, I need to generate a single point rubric. This is a tool that Chris and I were big fans of in our own classroom practice that we talk about using with teachers in schools all the time. Just gives some clear criteria that students should be able to hit to meet proficiency. And then on either side of that, you have, hey, you don't meet the standard for this for these reasons. Here's where to give feedback and fix it. Or, you know, hey, here's the areas where you clearly go above and beyond. That's awesome. I want to make note of that so you understand. And so I just asked ChatGPT based on those standards, hey, create a single point rubric for them. And it spit out what is above that table in black. I just created the table. You know, it's a 6-box table, a 2x3, and then I copied and pasted in there and added my categories to it. So of course you could change, modify the language, however, but in just about a minute and a half, I went from having that very wordy list of teacher-focused standards to a student-focused list that also generated a single point rubric for me that I could just go
just
into
think
a class
about
and use.
all of those PLC meetings that we never have to have ever again, of aligning
Right.
standards, rewriting the standards, identifying the themes of the standards, making sure that we can make interdisciplinary standards. The amount of hours that have been spent doing things that honestly typically don't even matter to kids or to teachers, in my opinion, but now we can mainstream and all, or we can not mainstream, what's the word I'm looking for? We can make it easier.
Streamline.
All right,
Yes.
all more fun.
Yes.
Great.
All right. Streamline. Thank you. Yes. So over to Trevor. Let's talk about this one really quick.
So speaking of streamlining, what I'm going to talk about is both great for streamlining your workflow, and I'm going to streamline our discussion of it because I think the curation one is probably a little bit more interesting. Composing emails and reading emails and sorting through emails, I feel like is the sort of administrative task that every teacher sort of loathes, but has also bloated within the last few years in terms of the amount of time and effort that goes into it. And ChatGPT is a really great way to help with that process. So 3 quick scenarios that I feel like ChatGPT could be useful for when it comes to emails. I know that everyone has received what one of my colleagues refers to as the red wine email at 5:30 that just feels like it has a little bit of extra edge to it from potentially a parent that's upset about something. Yeah, I wish I could say that I coined it, but I did not. You know, one of the things that my other colleagues and I sort of practice was reading each other's emails to make sure that our tone and our response like didn't reflect any emotions we might be sorting through at that moment, so sort of de-escalate the potential issue. And ChatGPT could be great at that, at like removing any language that might feel a little too pointed or might escalate further issues. Secondly, you know, if you have an email from another teacher or administrator where you are feeling upset or annoyed and it requires a timely response, but no one's around to kind of proofread it for you, you can ask ChatGPT to do that. Another thing that I've seen several teachers sort of struggle with is just kind of like email etiquette and helping students learn how to compose an email that is at least intelligible to the person that they are sending it to. And ChatGPT can help them with that. You know, personally, I am not like too hung up on that, but I know that there are teachers who have ended up spending a lot of time on that, and this could help streamline that. So really quickly, 2 tools that you could potentially use. The first is called Remail AI, and this one is like a complete automation where you can receive an email and Remail AI looks at the content of the email and creates a response. I've used it for a few emails, and for like generic template emails, like you have a student, Mr. Aleo, I need an extra day on this assignment. And it would respond in a way that's a little, bit more in depth than just like the 2-word template Gmail responses. Pumps out those emails really quickly. So that's one tool. Another tool is slightly different than the large language model stuff we've been talking about. It does use machine learning, but not in a large language model kind of way. It's called Speechify. It's something that I use very, very frequently. And you can use it to scan websites, PDFs, or email text, and it reads it out loud to you in a voice that is shockingly human. As you can see here, some of the examples are Gwyneth Paltrow or Snoop Dogg. The narrator is, I'm blanking on this guy, the British guy from all the nature documentaries.
David Attenborough.
There you go. Yeah, it sounds just like him. I guess they didn't get the rights to use his actual whatever, but just a really good way to help hear things. And I know that I feel better having an email read out loud to me, so I don't have any embarrassing typos or misspell someone's name or something. And it's also great to just listen to PDFs or websites if you are someone who is trying to engage with that content on the go. So
for sure, the accessibility component of this is mind-blowing
as well. Yes,
I think there's like the ability to be able to navigate things in a way that makes sense to you, both in terms of how you learn, but just how you're feeling that day. Like giving kids these tools to navigate the world can be really powerful, with an asterisk there for some of the concerns that could be there. For time purposes, Trevor, you just want to go through this one really quick?
Yeah, I'll run through it super fast. So this is all about curation. One of the things that is a really great practice is providing students with a really robust tech set. So no matter what discipline that you're teaching in, showing students information in a variety of ways and a variety of modalities is really powerful. And I have this really great kind of like infographic here that I created based on Cappiello and Dawes' Tech Sets in Action, Pathways Through Content Area Literacy book. And the prompts that I've curated are ways that you could use ChatGPT to curate a list of supplemental texts. So in an English context, I've used it to, have a central novel. We're reading Nella Larson's Passing. And I'm like, what are some examples of literary theory or a poem or a piece of art that explores similar themes? And it can curate that for you. So if you're doing something in history, you could look at a variety of texts or primary documents, whether from a different historical period or exploring a certain theme throughout history or in a certain period. So it's really great at saving that time, because again, some of my best lessons are when I have a really rich, awesome tech set, but the amount of time I spent just surfing the web trying to find something can get pretty astronomical. So it helps streamline that a lot. And these are just different prompts you can use based on different ways you could potentially organize your tech set.
For sure. And I think that something that's important to note that we have these examples here that are all like, I think things that are very obvious once you understand that it's a potential possibility that you could use it for. And it's worth noting that if you're joining a session like this or watching us online, you might see this as like really simple. This is something that should be taken back to your school or to your colleagues as like, hey, did you know that you could use it in this way? Because in our experience, the vast majority of educators that we speak to have never even booted it up. Their understanding of ChatGPT is from articles they've read, like what Nick has shared at the beginning. And as a result, they don't understand the ways that this could be a positive way of learning about education and talking about things, as opposed to a something that's going to destroy the foundations of K-12 schooling or something of that nature.
Yeah.
There's a happy middle ground there that we can find. So to provide some additional resources, if you're looking for a lot more stuff, and there is so much stuff out there, we tried to pare and curate this down into the spaces that we trust. At the bottom here, you'll find there's this document that was just released, I believe, in the last week from UNESCO, which is just an overview of AI in both education and in research. And it gives a lot of really nuanced takes on what this means, both in terms of transforming what we're doing in terms of research and academics, while also not, while being careful not to just embrace it altogether. there's this piece that was shared to us via Trevor, via Angela Stockman, which was amazing. This Canva piece that goes into a bunch of different resources that could be used for English, but I think K-12 more broadly, you could find something there. I'm really partial to this Thompson River University Guide to AI. It's kind of underground. It's just a random university, I guess, in Canada, but the website's really well made, and it just is a really brief overview of what's going on there. Cool visual guide. A few other things. These are all from HRP. We have a lesson that was designed to teach kids about AI, which you can find at this Google document right here. It's part of our interdisciplinary lesson plans. We have a video and student resource for the stereotyping component of this and sort of the dangers. It helps highlight how AI can reproduce stereotypes and have ethical concerns. We relatively recently had a podcast with the author of More Than a Glitch, which is a fantastic book on the biases of AI and the implications. Meredith Broussard is a data scientist, and she does this work, but she also recognizes the ethical concerns of it, wrote a whole book on it. Definitely check that out. And again, this is part of if you just happen to be at NCTE or in Columbus, Ohio in November, we're doing a 4-hour session on AI, which this is kind of building into. Finally, if you want to join us and learn more about a ton of just random applications for ChatGPT that go way more into the weeds, our next session is entirely activities. So now that we've provided the context, the next thing will be entirely activities, which is on September 9th at the same time, 11 a.m. Eastern. October 14th at the same time, we'll then dive into the ethical stuff, which is right here. And again, if you appreciate this work, feel free to drop us a little donation. It's all available for free online. If you want some cool stickers or t-shirts or mugs or something, check out our funding drive. Any other final questions, notes, concerns, inquiries?
Can I just add here?
AI EDU. Yeah.
I'll add real quick here since I mentioned it in the chat, but I think stuff like this just really helps see through both the hype and the doom and gloom, right? Just understanding what ChatGPT is and how it can be used for actual pro-human, pro-social, pro-educative purposes. So we don't have to shut it down. We don't have to revere it. We can treat it appropriately for what it is and use it in ways that are most useful and helpful for us and for kids, and to have those conversations with them too. So I appreciate the folks who joined us today and in the chat for being vulnerable and for asking those great questions. And hopefully we'll have some folks join us for the upcoming sessions as well.
For sure. Cool. Ezra, feel free to ask a question. We'll be here. We're good.
I'm just going to say it because sometimes typing takes me a while.
You're good.
So for the rubric prompt, is it like, what exactly did you put into ChatGPT? Was it just kind of like it already had the standards in because you had asked it to rewrite it, and then you were like, write a rubric based on these standards?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure Nick quite literally typed in, generate a single point rubric for these standards. Is that right, Nick?
Anything that's in green on that, anything that's in green on my section there is the exact prompt that I used in ChatGPT. So I copied and pasted from my ChatGPT prompt into that section on Figma. So yeah, it understands language pretty intuitively, which is nice. But you can kind of fudge around with it a little bit to see what gets you the best results. That's just what ended up getting me the results that worked best for me.
Okay, yeah. So sorry, just to clarify, when you had written in ChatGPT these standards, it had already had like the history, right? Like that was all one session for you?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So that is the important part, right? Because it's going to know what you're talking about based on the previous inputs that you put in for each session. So yes, thank you, Chris, for actually modeling that as well.
And it's not perfect because like right now it doesn't understand what single point rubric is. It's giving me a it's giving me a regular really interesting. Rubric. See, so sometimes you have to correct it.
Yeah, I've used ChatGPT to make single point rubrics, so maybe it just knows from my preferences and my my previous sessions as well. But Chris is very polite in correcting ChatGPT and his stuff too.
Do y'all have ChatGPT like the 3.5 or the 4?
So we've used both. Yeah, I'll hit the well, this kind of understands it here. We've used both. We've used 4.0. Right now, we're just using the default 3.5 to demonstrate. Certainly the 4.0 is better in many regards, especially when it comes to more creative use cases, and being able to write at a deeper level. I think that 3.5 is sufficient for most of what educators are doing, especially if you have like a toolkit of other AI tools. One that I'm super impartial to is elicit.org, which is used for research. If you're looking for like a Google Scholar, but an AI version of it, this thing's incredible. And we use this all the time organizationally. Trevor had brought up the email server, etc. There's a bunch of different tools that exist that I think you can utilize for free without having to pay.
Well, that was actually a question. Like, did you? Because when I had joined ChatGPT, like with the free account, it had come up with a prompt somewhere that was basically like, "Oh, you'll get a certain set of free prompts before you'll have to pay." Like, have y'all ever encountered that?
So I know it restricts you after a while of like if you use it too much, there's like a limit that seems to change almost daily. Like they consistently like are coming up with new ways, because right now this is operating at an extreme loss. And one of the concerns is that because they're likely to sell this company at this multi-billion-dollar evaluation, that access to this will be lost in some way. I have a strong feeling that what will happen as a result is that we'll replace it with various other AI tools that are drawing upon other language. Like you have Google's Bard, you have the Bing one. There'll probably always be some kind of freely available tool. Luckily, the Plus is relatively cheap for what it does, but certainly pricing is always a concern.
There's another one called Poe, and it's sort of like a AI platform where it hosts a bunch of different bots on one I guess platform.
Mhm.
And it's free, but you do have to sign up. So that's something that I've checked out as well. It has ChatGPT on there, but it has a bunch of other ones too.
I have to sign up for that.
Thanks. And also, this is kind of related. Like, how do you know that if, say, you're translating something, right? How do you
Mhm.
know it's translating, especially if you don't know the language yourself? How do you know it's translating correctly? Is it like you just got to trust the stats or however the language
Yeah.
model works?
So what I would do is at the bottom of my translation, I would just say like, "Hey, this was like in the language." I would write that this is translated using Chat GPT. There may be errors, etc. Like I would tell it that I used it in the exact same way that when I was teaching and I sent something home that was in Spanish, I wrote at the bottom, both in English and in Spanish using the translation software, like this was compiled using Google Translate. So
Mm,
please forgive me if there's any errors. I found that no one ever said anything about Google Translate being wrong, so I have a highly doubt that it would be that far off. I think in some cases, because teachers are so under resourced, it's the thought that counts. That at least
right.
because we're attempting, we can figure out the general idea of it.
Mm, got it. Okay. Thank you so much.
Of course, of course. Yeah, I think that's all we got here. But again, Ezra, we appreciate you joining us. We appreciate everybody watching us online. And Trevor, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, guys. Looking forward to the next one.
Cool. All right. See y'all soon. If I could get the thing to turn off. Right now, we'll just stare at each other awkwardly. There we go. Cool. All
Classic.
right.